The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Windsor Castle as 10-year-old Prince George walked quietly through the corridors. Unlike other days filled with royal duties and formal lessons, today felt different. The young prince had been watching, learning, and most importantly, listening to the conversations around him. For weeks, George had noticed something troubling. The royal guards who protected his family worked incredibly long hours, often missing meals and time with their own families. He had overheard his protection officer, James Mitchell, quietly mention to another guard that he hadn't seen his daughter's school play because of his duty schedule. The comment stuck with George more than any of his history lessons ever had. James Mitchell was a dedicated man in his early 40s who had served the royal family for nearly 15 years. His weathered face told stories of countless hours standing at attention, protecting those he had sworn to serve. What George didn't know was that James had been struggling with more than just missing family events. His wife had been battling illness, and the demanding schedule left him torn between his duty to the crown and his responsibility to his family. That particular morning, George had awakened earlier than usual. Instead of heading straight to breakfast, he decided to take a walk through the castle grounds. As he rounded a corner near the guard quarters, he heard quiet sobbing. Peering around carefully, he saw James sitting alone on a bench, his head in his hands, still wearing his formal red uniform. The sight of the strong guard crying moved something deep within George's young heart. He had been taught about duty, service, and responsibility since he could walk. But in that moment, he understood something his tutors had never explicitly taught him: that true leadership meant caring for those who cared for you. George approached slowly, his footsteps soft on the gravel path. James quickly wiped his eyes and stood to attention when he noticed the young prince approaching. "Your Royal Highness," James said, his voice slightly hoarse from emotion. "I apologize. I didn't expect anyone to be up this early." George looked up at the tall guard with curious, caring eyes. "Why are you sad, James?" he asked simply, the way only a child could. James hesitated, unsure how to explain adult problems to a 10-year-old prince. "It's nothing important, sir. Just some personal matters." But George was more perceptive than many gave him credit for. He had inherited his mother's emotional intelligence and his father's sense of justice. "Is it about your family?" he asked gently. The directness of the question caught James off guard. For a moment, his professional composure cracked and he nodded slightly. "My wife, she's not well. And my daughter had her first solo in the school choir yesterday. I've missed so many important moments." George listened intently, his young mind processing the weight of sacrifice that came with serving his family. He thought about all the times James had stood guard during family dinners, birthday parties, and holidays while his own family waited at home. "That's not fair," George said with the honest clarity that only children possess. "You should be with your family when they need you." James smiled sadly. "It's my duty, Your Highness. Your family's safety comes first." George nodded, understanding the concept of duty, but something didn't sit right with him. He had been taught that with great privilege comes great responsibility, but shouldn't that responsibility extend to caring for those who served them? Over the next few days, George began paying closer attention to the guards around the castle. He noticed how they stood for hours without breaks, how they ate their meals quickly while on duty, and how they never complained despite obvious fatigue. He saw Marcus, another guard, trying to help his son with homework over the phone during a brief break. He watched Sarah, one of the few female guards, checking her phone anxiously for updates about her elderly mother. The young prince began to realize that behind every uniform was a person with their own hopes, fears, and families. These weren't just protectors. They were people who had made significant sacrifices to serve his family. George's tutors had often spoken about historical leaders who were remembered for their compassion and care for their subjects. Stories of kings and queens who went beyond their duties to ensure the well-being of those around them. But those had always seemed like distant tales from history books. Now George was beginning to understand that leadership wasn't just about being served. It was about serving others in return. That evening, as George sat with his parents for dinner, he found himself distracted. His mother, Catherine, noticed his unusual quietness. "George, you seem thoughtful today. Is everything all right?" she asked with motherly concern. George looked up from his plate, considering his words carefully. "Mummy, Do our guards ever get to spend time with their families? The question surprised both his parents. His father, William, set down his fork and gave George his full attention. They have scheduled time off, yes. Why do you ask? George thought about James crying on the bench, about Marcus helping his son with homework over the phone, about all the small sacrifices he had witnessed. I think they work too hard. James missed his daughter's performance and his wife is sick. Catherine and William exchanged glances. They had always tried to be considerate employers, but perhaps they hadn't fully understood the personal impact of the demanding security requirements. What do you think we should do about it? William asked, genuinely curious about his son's perspective. George considered the question seriously. I think we should make sure they have time for their families. Real time, not just quick phone calls. That night, as George lay in bed, he couldn't stop thinking about James and the other guards. He had been taught that being royal meant serving the people, but he was beginning to understand that service started with those closest to you. The guards who protected his family deserved protection too. Protection of their time, their relationships, and their well-being. Unknown to George, his simple observations and questions had planted a seed that would grow into something much larger. His genuine care for the people around him was about to set in motion a series of events that would touch hearts throughout the castle and beyond. The next morning brought an unexpected turn of events. George woke with a sense of purpose that surprised even him. After getting dressed, he made a decision that would have shocked his etiquette tutors. He headed directly to the guard station instead of the breakfast room. James was already at his post, standing at attention near the main entrance. His eyes were clearer than the day before, but George could still see the weight of worry in his shoulders. The young prince approached with determination, carrying something in his small hands. James, George called softly, causing the guard to turn and bow slightly. Good morning, Your Royal Highness. You're up early again. George held out his hand, revealing a small handwritten note. I wrote this for your daughter. I heard she sang in the choir. James took the note with trembling fingers, his professional composure momentarily forgotten. The note was written in George's careful handwriting. Dear Lily, I heard you sang beautifully in your choir. I'm sorry your daddy couldn't be there, but he was taking care of my family. That makes you a hero's daughter. I hope I can hear you sing someday. Prince George. The guard's eyes filled with tears as he read the simple but heartfelt message. No one had ever acknowledged his family's sacrifice before, let alone royalty. The gesture was so unexpected, so genuine, that it left him speechless. Your Highness? James managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. This means more than you could ever know. George smiled, pleased to see James looking less sad, but his young mind was already working on something bigger. James, what if I talk to my parents about making things better for all the guards? Before James could respond, footsteps echoed down the corridor. Marcus, the guard George had seen, helping his son with homework, approached for the shift change. George turned to him with the same direct kindness he had shown James. Marcus, how is your son doing with his math homework? George asked, remembering the phone conversation he had overheard. Marcus looked surprised that the young prince had noticed such a detail. He's struggling a bit, Your Highness, but we're working through it. Maybe during your next break you could help him properly instead of over the phone, George suggested innocently. Both guards exchanged glances, touched by the prince's awareness of their personal lives. In all their years of service, none of the royal family had ever inquired about their families with such genuine interest. Word of George's kindness began to spread quietly among the guard staff. Sarah, the female guard George had noticed checking on her mother, was particularly moved when she heard about the note he had written for James's daughter. That afternoon, when George passed her post, he stopped to ask about her mother's health. She's doing better, thank you for asking, Your Highness, Sarah replied, clearly touched by his concern. That's good. You must worry about her when you're here, George observed with the straightforward honesty that adults often avoided. Sarah nodded, surprised by how accurately the 10-year-old had understood her situation. Sometimes I do, yes. Maybe we could arrange for someone to check on her when you can't, George suggested thoughtfully. The simple suggestion revealed a level of empathy that went beyond his years. George wasn't just noticing problems. He was thinking about solutions. His natural instinct to help others was beginning to manifest in practical ways. That evening, George approached his parents with unusual seriousness. He had spent the day observing and thinking, and he had formed what he considered a very important plan. "Mummy, Daddy, I need to talk to you about the guards," he announced during their private family time. Catherine and William could see this wasn't a passing childhood whim. Their son had clearly been giving this matter serious thought. "We're listening," William said, setting aside his papers to give George his full attention. George took a deep breath and began to explain everything he had observed. He told them about James crying, about Marcus helping his son over the phone, about Sarah worrying about her mother. He spoke about how the guards stood for hours without proper breaks and how they missed important family moments. "I think we should give them more time off," George concluded. "Not just one day here and there, but real time to be with their families." Catherine was moved by her son's compassion. "George, that's very thoughtful of you. But you understand that security arrangements are quite complex?" "I know it's complicated," George replied seriously. "But James has been protecting us for 15 years. Don't we owe him the chance to protect his own family too?" The question hit both parents powerfully. They had always treated their staff well, but perhaps they hadn't fully considered the personal cost of such dedicated service. William leaned forward, intrigued by his son's perspective. "What exactly are you proposing?" George had clearly thought this through. "What if we hired more guards so they could work shorter hours? And what if we helped their families sometimes, like checking on Sarah's mother or making sure Marcus's son gets help with homework?" The suggestions were remarkably mature for a 10-year-old. George wasn't just thinking about being nice. He was considering practical solutions to real problems. "And," George continued with growing enthusiasm, "what if we had a party for all the guard families, so we could meet them and say thank you properly?" Catherine and William were genuinely impressed by their son's thoughtfulness. They had always hoped to raise children who understood their responsibilities to others, but seeing George naturally develop such empathy was both surprising and heartening. "These are wonderful ideas, George," Catherine said warmly. "But implementing changes like this would require careful planning." "I know," George replied, "but we could start small. Maybe just making sure James gets to see his daughter's next performance?" The simplicity and sincerity of the request made it impossible to refuse. Here was their 10-year-old son, not asking for toys or privileges, but advocating for the well-being of their staff. That night, after George had gone to bed, Catherine and William discussed their son's proposals seriously. They realized that while they had always been considerate employers, they had perhaps focused more on professional satisfaction than personal well-being for their security team. "He's right, you know," Catherine said thoughtfully. "These people dedicate their lives to protecting our family. The least we can do is ensure they have time to live their own lives." William nodded, already beginning to consider how they might restructure security arrangements to be more family-friendly. "I'm proud of him for noticing, and for caring enough to do something about it." Meanwhile, in his room, George lay awake thinking about James, Marcus, Sarah, and all the other guards who had devoted their lives to serving his family. He felt a growing sense of responsibility. Not the kind his tutors taught him about duty and protocol, but a deeper understanding of what it meant to truly care for others. The seed of an idea that had begun with a crying guard on a bench was beginning to grow into something much larger than anyone could have imagined. 3 days later, George's plan began to take shape in ways he hadn't expected. His parents had been quietly working behind the scenes, consulting with security chiefs and human resources about implementing some of their son's suggestions. But George, impatient with adult processes, decided to take matters into his own hands. During his morning walk, he stopped by James's post with another surprise. This time he carried a small wrapped package and wore an expression of barely contained excitement. "James, I have something for you," George announced, holding out the gift. James accepted the package with curious gratitude. Inside, he found a small photo frame containing a picture of the royal family. But what made it special was the personal note attached. "For James, thank you for keeping us safe so your family can be proud of you." We think about your sacrifices every day, but George wasn't finished. I also talked to my parents. They're going to make sure you can go to Lily's next performance. James stared at the young prince in amazement. In 15 years of service, no one had ever made such a personal gesture. The fact that it came from a 10-year-old made it even more touching. Your Highness, I don't know what to say, James managed, his voice breaking slightly. You don't have to say anything, George replied with a wisdom that seemed beyond his years. You've been saying thank you every day by taking care of us. Word of George's continued kindness spread throughout the castle staff like wildfire. The guards began to realize that their young prince wasn't just going through a phase of childhood curiosity. He genuinely cared about their well-being. That afternoon, George encountered Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, the head of housekeeping, who had worked at the castle for over 20 years. She had always been kind to George, often sneaking him extra biscuits when he was younger. Now, seeing her looking tired after a long day, George felt the same impulse to help that had driven him to reach out to the guards. Mrs. Patterson, you look tired. When do you get to rest? George asked with his characteristic directness. Eleanor was touched by his concern. Oh, Your Highness, I'm fine. Just a busy day preparing for the upcoming state visit. George frowned thoughtfully. But when do you get to spend time with your husband? I remember you said he likes gardening. The fact that George remembered such a small detail from a conversation months ago brought tears to Eleanor's eyes. You're very kind to remember, sir. Harold does love his garden. Maybe you could take tomorrow afternoon off to help him plant something special, George suggested earnestly. Eleanor was moved by the suggestion but felt obligated to decline. That's very thoughtful, but there's too much work to prepare for the visit. George considered this seriously. What if I helped? I could polish the silver or arrange flowers. Mummy taught me how. The image of the future king polishing silver to give a staff member time off was both touching and slightly absurd, but George's sincerity made the offer feel perfectly natural. Later that day, George approached his parents with a new understanding of how the castle operated. He had spent time talking with various staff members and had begun to see the complex web of work that kept their home running smoothly. I think we should help Mrs. Patterson too, he announced during dinner, and Cook says her daughter is getting married next month, but she might not be able to go to the wedding. Catherine and William exchanged glances. Their son's circle of concern was expanding beyond the guards to encompass all the staff who served their family. George, William said gently, we appreciate your thoughtfulness, but we can't completely reorganize the castle's operations. Why not? George asked with the logical simplicity of a child. If we're supposed to serve the people, shouldn't we start with the people who serve us? The question was so profound in its simplicity that it left both parents momentarily speechless. George had somehow grasped a fundamental principle of leadership that many adults never understood. Catherine leaned forward, genuinely curious about her son's thinking. What exactly do you think we should do? George had clearly been giving this considerable thought. We could have a meeting with everyone who works here. We could ask them what would make their lives better and then try to help. That's a big undertaking, William observed. But it's the right thing to do, George replied with quiet conviction. Isn't that what you and Mummy always teach me? To do the right thing even when it's hard? That evening, Catherine and William found themselves having a deep conversation about their son's remarkable development. They had always known George was intelligent and kind, but his recent behavior showed a level of emotional maturity that impressed them both. He's making us better people, Catherine observed. His simple questions are forcing us to examine things we've taken for granted. William nodded thoughtfully. I think he's teaching us what true leadership looks like, not just commanding respect but earning it through genuine care. Meanwhile, George was in his room, writing in a small notebook he had started keeping. He was documenting the various staff members' situations and his ideas for helping them. The notebook contained entries like James, daughter's performances, Marcus, son's homework, Sarah, mother's health, and Mrs. Patterson, garden time with husband. As he wrote, George felt a growing sense of purpose. He was beginning to understand that being born into privilege wasn't just about enjoying benefits, it was about using those benefits to make life better for others. The next morning brought an unexpected development. James approached George with news that would change everything. Your Highness, James said, his voice filled with emotion. I need to tell you something important. Yesterday, after you spoke with Mrs. Patterson, she came to me in tears. She said that in 20 years of service, no member of the royal family had ever asked about her personal life or shown such genuine concern for her well-being. George listened intently, not fully understanding the significance of what James was telling him. She's not the only one, James continued. All of us who work here have been talking. Your kindness has reminded us why we chose to serve your family in the first place. But more than that, it's made us feel truly valued as people, not just as employees. George's face lit up with happiness. Does that mean everyone's feeling better? James smiled, but there was something else in his expression, a mixture of gratitude and determination that George didn't quite understand yet. It means you've done something very special, Your Highness. You've shown us what true nobility looks like. As James walked away, George felt proud but also slightly confused by the guard's serious tone. He had simply been trying to be kind, the way his parents had taught him. He didn't realize that his actions were setting in motion events that would soon touch the heart of everyone in the castle. A week later, George's parents called him into his father's study for what they described as an important family meeting. George entered to find both parents sitting with serious but warm expressions, and several official-looking documents spread across the desk. George, we've been thinking carefully about everything you've shared with us, William began, and we've made some decisions. George's heart raced with anticipation. He had been hoping his parents would take his suggestions seriously, but he hadn't expected such a formal response. Catherine smiled at her son's obvious excitement. We're implementing what we're calling the Castle Family Care Initiative. It includes many of the ideas you suggested. Really? George asked, his eyes wide with amazement. William nodded. We're hiring additional security staff so that current guards can work more reasonable hours. We're also creating a family support fund to help with emergencies, education, and special occasions. George could hardly believe what he was hearing. His simple observations had grown into something official and important. But that's not all, Catherine continued. We want you to be involved in overseeing this initiative. After all, it was your idea. The responsibility felt both exciting and slightly overwhelming to the 10-year-old. What would I have to do? You'd meet regularly with staff representatives to hear their concerns and suggestions, William explained. Think of it as being our family's official liaison for staff well-being. George considered this seriously. The idea of having a real job, a real way to help people, filled him with purpose. When do we start? We've scheduled the first meeting for tomorrow, Catherine said. We thought you might want to invite James to be there since he was the first person you helped. That evening, George could barely contain his excitement. He found James at his evening post and shared the news with bubbling enthusiasm. James, we're starting a program to help all the staff and I get to help run it. James listened with growing amazement as George explained the family care initiative. When the prince finished, James was quiet for a long moment. Your Highness, James said finally, his voice thick with emotion. What you've done, it's going to change lives. Real lives. George beamed with pride, but James wasn't finished. I need to tell you something, James continued, his expression becoming more serious. What you've started here, this kindness and genuine care, it's reminded all of us why we chose this work. But more than that, it's shown us what real leadership looks like. George listened carefully, sensing that James was trying to tell him something important. For 15 years, I've served your family with loyalty and dedication, James went on. But in the past weeks, serving you has felt different. It's felt like serving someone who truly sees us as people, not just protectors. The next day's meeting exceeded everyone's expectations. George sat at the head of a long table in one of the castle's smaller conference rooms, flanked by his parents and facing representatives from every department of castle staff. James was there along with Marcus, Sarah, Mrs. Patterson, the head chef, gardeners, housekeepers, and others. George had prepared carefully for the meeting, consulting his notebook of staff situations and practicing what he wanted to say. When it came time to speak, he stood up with remarkable composure for his age. I want to thank everyone for all the hard work you do for our family, he began, his voice clear and sincere. I've been learning about your lives outside of work, and I think we haven't been doing enough to help you balance taking care of us with taking care of your own families. The room was completely silent, every person hanging on his words. We want to change that, George continued. Not because we have to, but because it's right. You take care of us every day. Now we want to take care of you. What followed was an open discussion that revealed just how much the staff's lives had been impacted by the demanding nature of their work. Stories emerged of missed graduations, delayed medical appointments, and financial stress from unexpected family emergencies. Mrs. Patterson spoke about how she had missed her grandson's first steps because of a state dinner. Marcus shared his struggle to help his son with learning difficulties while working long, unpredictable hours. Sarah talked about the anxiety of leaving her aging mother alone during overnight security shifts. George listened to each story with intense focus, occasionally asking questions that showed he truly understood the human cost of their service. His parents watched with pride as their son demonstrated empathy and problem-solving skills that rivaled those of much older leaders. By the end of the meeting, they had outlined a comprehensive plan. Flexible scheduling would allow staff to attend important family events. An emergency fund would help with unexpected financial crises. Professional development opportunities would help staff advance their careers. And perhaps most importantly, regular check-ins would ensure that people's changing needs were addressed promptly. As the meeting concluded, something unexpected happened. James stood up, his face showing deep emotion. "Your Royal Highnesses," he said formally, "I need to say something on behalf of all of us." The room fell silent as James struggled to find the right words. "For years, we've served this family with pride and dedication, but today we've experienced something different. We've felt truly seen, truly valued, truly cared for." Other staff members began nodding in agreement, many with tears in their eyes. "Prince George," James continued, turning to address the young boy directly, "your kindness has reminded us of something we had almost forgotten. That service is most meaningful when it flows both ways." George looked around the room at all the faces of people he had come to care about. He saw tears in many eyes, but they seemed to be happy tears. "What you've initiated here isn't just about better working conditions," James went on. "It's about dignity, respect, and genuine human connection. You've shown us what true nobility means." The room erupted in spontaneous applause, with every staff member standing to honor the young prince who had seen them as people first and employees second. As George looked around at the faces surrounding him, James with his proud smile, Mrs. Patterson dabbing at her eyes, Marcus grinning widely, Sarah standing tall with renewed confidence, he felt something he had never experienced before. It wasn't just happiness or pride, but a deep sense of rightness, as if he had discovered his true purpose. That evening, as the family debriefed the meeting's success, George asked his parents a question that showed how much he had grown. "Mummy, Daddy, do you think helping people is the most important thing about being royal?" Catherine and William exchanged a meaningful look before William answered. "I think, George, that you've just discovered the real secret of leadership. It's not about being served. It's about serving others." George nodded thoughtfully, already planning how he could expand their efforts to help even more people. He didn't realize that his simple act of kindness was about to have consequences none of them could have predicted. 2 weeks after the successful staff meeting, George was walking through the castle gardens when he noticed something unusual. James was sitting on the same bench where George had first found him crying, but this time he wasn't alone. Marcus, Sarah, and several other guards were gathered around him, all looking serious and emotional. George approached cautiously, concerned that something was wrong. As he got closer, he could hear fragments of their conversation. "Never experienced anything like it," James was saying. "Completely changed how I see this job." Marcus added, "Finally feel like we matter as people," Sarah contributed. When they noticed George approaching, the group fell silent. James stood up quickly, followed by the others. "Your Highness," James said, his voice carrying an unusual weight, "we were just discussing recent events." George could see that everyone seemed emotional, but he couldn't tell if they were happy or sad. "Is everything okay? Did I do something wrong?" The question seemed to surprise all the guards. Sarah stepped forward, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Oh no, Your Highness. You've done everything right. That's exactly what we were talking about." Over the next few minutes, George learned that his initiative had created ripple effects throughout the castle that no one had anticipated. The guards explained that for the first time in their careers, they felt truly valued not just for their service, but as complete human beings with families, dreams, and personal struggles. Yesterday, Marcus shared, I was able to attend my son's parent-teacher conference for the first time in 3 years because of the new flexible scheduling. My boy was so proud to introduce me to his teacher. And I finally got to take my mother to her doctor's appointment, Sarah added. She's been asking me to come with her for months, but I never could before. James looked directly at George with an expression the young prince had never seen before. A mixture of gratitude, respect, and something deeper. Your Highness, what you've done has reminded us why we chose this profession. We didn't become guards just for a job. We became guards because we wanted to serve something greater than ourselves. But over the years, it became easy to forget that the something greater includes people who care about us as individuals. George listened intently, beginning to understand that his simple acts of kindness had touched something much deeper than he had realized. I want to tell you something, James continued, his voice becoming more emotional. My daughter Lily performed in another school concert last week. Because of your new policies, I was able to attend. George's face lit up with happiness. How did she do? She was magnificent, James replied, tears forming in his eyes. But the most beautiful moment wasn't her performance. It was when she spotted me in the audience and her face just lit up. She had given up hoping I would ever make it to one of her events. The image of Lily's happy face filled George with warmth. This was exactly what he had hoped would happen. After the concert, James went on, she asked me why things had changed, why I was suddenly able to be there for her important moments. So I told her about you. George looked puzzled. About me? I told her about a young prince who noticed that the people protecting his family had families of their own that needed protecting too. I told her about how you saw us as people, not just guards in uniforms. Sarah stepped forward, unable to contain her emotion any longer. Your Highness, you need to understand something. In all my years of service, I've protected important people. I've traveled the world, I've been part of history, but I've never felt as honored to serve anyone as I do to serve you. The other guards murmured their agreement, and George could see that many of them were fighting back tears. What you've shown us, Marcus added, is that true leadership isn't about commanding respect through authority. It's about earning respect through compassion. George felt overwhelmed by the intensity of their gratitude. He had simply been trying to be kind, the way his parents had taught him. He hadn't realized that kindness could have such a powerful impact. I just wanted to help, George said quietly. You all work so hard to take care of us. It didn't seem fair that no one was taking care of you. The simplicity and sincerity of his response moved the guards even more deeply. Here was a 10-year-old prince who understood something that many adults in positions of power never grasped. That true leadership meant serving others, not being served by them. James looked around at his colleagues, and George could see some kind of silent communication passing between them. Finally, James turned back to George with an expression of determination. Your Highness, we've been talking among ourselves, and we've reached a decision. What you've done for us has been so meaningful, so transformative, that we want to do something for you in return. George looked curious, but slightly confused. You don't need to do anything for me. You already protect my family every day. That's our job, Sarah explained. This would be something different. Something personal. Marcus stepped forward. We want to nominate you for the Young Leader of the Year award from the Royal Service Association. It's an honor given to young people who demonstrate exceptional leadership and compassion. George had never heard of such an award, but he could tell from their faces that it was important to them. But more than that, James continued, we want to write letters to newspapers and magazines telling them about what you've done. We want the world to know that there's a young prince who cares more about serving others than being served. The idea of such public attention made George uncomfortable. He hadn't been kind because he wanted recognition. He had been kind because it felt right. I don't need awards or newspapers, George said earnestly. I just want everyone to be happy. The guards exchanged glances again, and George could see that his response had moved them even more deeply. And that, James said softly, is exactly why you deserve recognition. You don't seek attention for your kindness, you just act with a pure heart. That evening, George shared the conversation with his parents, still feeling somewhat overwhelmed by the guards' intense gratitude. I don't understand why they're so emotional, he confessed to his mother as she tucked him into bed. I was just being nice. Catherine smiled at her son's innocence. George, What you think of as just being nice has fundamentally changed how an entire group of people view their work and their worth. That's not a small thing, but shouldn't that be normal? George asked. Shouldn't everyone be nice to the people who help them? William, who had been listening from the doorway, entered the room with a proud but slightly sad smile. Yes, it should be normal, he agreed. But unfortunately, it's quite rare. Many people in positions of power forget to see the humanity in those who serve them. You've reminded our staff that they matter as individuals, and that's a gift beyond measure. George considered this as his parents said goodnight. As he drifted off to sleep, he thought about Lily's happy face when she saw her father in the audience, about Marcus helping his son with homework without rushing, about Sarah being able to care for her mother properly. He didn't realize that his story was about to reach far beyond the castle walls, touching hearts in ways he never could have imagined. The following Monday morning brought an unexpected scene at Windsor Castle. George was having breakfast with his parents when their private secretary entered, with an unusual expression of excitement mixed with concern. Your Royal Highnesses, he announced, we have a situation that requires your immediate attention. William looked up from his newspaper, alert to the serious tone. What kind of situation? It appears that someone has leaked the story of Prince George's staff initiative to the media. The phones haven't stopped ringing since 6 this morning. George looked confused. What does that mean? Catherine explained gently. It means that people outside the castle have heard about what you've been doing for our staff. The private secretary continued. The initial story appeared in The Guardian this morning. Written by someone using only initials. JM, it's titled The 10-Year-Old Prince Who Taught Us What True Leadership Means. George's eyes widened. JM? That's James Mitchell. William quickly retrieved his phone to pull up the article. As he read, his expression shifted from concern to amazement to deep pride. George, he said softly, you need to hear this. William began reading aloud. I have served the royal family for 15 years. In that time, I have witnessed history, protected precious lives, and taken pride in my duty. But never in all those years have I experienced anything like what happened when a 10-year-old prince noticed that I was crying. George listened with wide eyes as his father continued reading James's detailed account of their first meeting, the young prince's subsequent acts of kindness, and the transformation that had occurred among the entire castle staff. The article described how George had written a note to James's daughter, how he had advocated for better working conditions for all staff, and how he had personally overseen the implementation of family-friendly policies. But more than the actions themselves, James had written about the genuine care and empathy that motivated everything George did. In my 15 years of service, William read from the article's conclusion, I have protected royalty, but in the past month, I have had the honor of witnessing true nobility in action. Prince George has shown us that real leadership isn't about commanding others, it's about lifting them up. The article went on to describe how the other guards felt about George's initiative, including quotes from Sarah about finally being able to care for her mother, and Marcus about attending his son's school events. By the time William finished reading, the private secretary had returned with more news. Sir, we've now received calls from BBC, ITV, CNN, and over a dozen newspapers requesting interviews. Social media is exploding with the hashtag #CharlesPrinceOfCompassion. George looked overwhelmed. Why are so many people interested? Catherine took his hand gently. Because what you did is very special, George. Most people in positions of power don't think about the personal lives of the people who work for them. But that's just basic kindness, George protested. Exactly, William said with pride. And that's why the story is resonating with so many people. They're inspired by your example. Throughout the day, the story continued to spread. Other members of the castle staff began sharing their own experiences on social media. Mrs. Patterson posted a photo of herself gardening with her husband, with the caption, "For the first time in 20 years, I had time to plant flowers with Harold, thanks to a 10-year-old prince who cares about our happiness." Cook shared a video message about being able to attend her daughter's wedding, describing how George had personally ensured she wouldn't miss the ceremony. But it was a video posted by James's daughter, Lily, that truly captured public attention. The 12-year-old girl, with her father's permission, recorded herself explaining how a prince she had never met had made it possible for her daddy to attend her school performances. "I used to be sad that my dad missed everything important," Lily said in the video. But Prince George noticed that my dad was sad too and he fixed it. Now my dad can come to my concerts and help me with homework. Prince George cares about families, even families he doesn't know. The video quickly went viral, accumulating millions of views within hours. Comments poured in from people around the world, sharing their own stories about feeling unseen or undervalued at work, and expressing hope that more leaders would follow George's example. That evening, George found himself feeling strangely emotional about all the attention. He had simply wanted to help the people around him, and now the entire world seemed to be talking about it. He sought out James, finding him at his usual evening post. The guard's face lit up when he saw the young prince approaching. "Your Highness," James said warmly, "I hope you're not upset about the article. I felt that your story needed to be told." George shook his head. "I'm not upset. I just don't understand why everyone thinks it's so special. Aren't people supposed to be kind to each other?" James knelt down to George's level, his expression serious but gentle. "They are supposed to be, Your Highness, but unfortunately many people forget that. Especially when they have power. What you've done has reminded the world what leadership should look like." "But I'm just a kid," George said quietly. "Yes," James agreed, "and that's what makes it even more powerful. You haven't learned to be selfish or to take people for granted. You still see everyone as equally important." That night, as George's family watched news coverage of the story, they saw interviews with leadership experts, child psychologists, and even other members of royal families from around the world, all praising George's example. One expert commented, "Prince George has demonstrated emotional intelligence and leadership skills that many adults never develop. His actions show us that true authority comes from serving others, not from being served." Another royal expert noted, "This young prince is already showing the qualities that make for transformational leadership. He sees problems, he empathizes with those affected, and he takes action to create positive change." But perhaps the most moving coverage came from ordinary people sharing their own experiences. A teacher in Manchester posted about how the story inspired her to check on her students' home situations. A business owner in Scotland announced new family-friendly policies for his employees, directly crediting Prince George's example. As George prepared for bed that night, he reflected on the day's events with his parents. "Mummy, do you think all this attention will help other people be kinder?" he asked. Catherine smiled at her son's pure motivation. "I think it already has, George. You've started something much bigger than you realize." "Good," George said with satisfaction. "Maybe James's daughter and Marcus's son and Sarah's mother won't be the only ones who get help." As his parents tucked him in, George had no idea that his story was just beginning to unfold, or that his simple acts of kindness were about to inspire changes far beyond anything he could have imagined. The young prince fell asleep peacefully, dreaming of a world where everyone looked out for each other, the way he had learned to look out for the people in his castle. 3 months later, the impact of George's story had grown beyond anyone's wildest expectations. The castle had received thousands of letters from children and adults around the world, sharing how his example had inspired them to be more compassionate in their own lives. On this particular morning, George was surprised to find James waiting for him in the garden, not at his usual post. The guard's face showed a mixture of emotions that George had never seen before. Pride, gratitude, and something that looked almost like sadness. "James," George called out happily, "why aren't you at your post?" James took a deep breath before responding. "Your Highness, I need to speak with you about something very important." The serious tone made George pay careful attention. "Is everything okay? Is Lily all right?" "Lily is wonderful," James assured him quickly. "Actually, she's better than she's ever been, thanks to you. That's part of what I need to talk to you about." George waited patiently as James seemed to struggle with his words. "Your Highness," James began, "what you did for me, for all of us, has changed our lives in ways you may never fully understand. Because of your kindness and the new policies your family implemented, I've been able to be a real father to Lily for the first time in years." George smiled, pleased to hear this confirmation of what he had hoped would happen. "I've attended every one of her school performances since then," James continued. "I've helped her with homework, taken her to the park, and even coached her softball team. For the first time, I feel like I'm not just her father in name, but truly present in her life. That's wonderful, James," George said warmly. It is wonderful, James agreed, his voice becoming more emotional. And that's why I have to make the most difficult decision of my life. George felt a flutter of concern. What do you mean? James knelt down to George's level, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Your Highness, I am submitting my resignation from the Royal Guard. The words hit George like a physical blow. What, but James, did I do something wrong? Are you angry with me? No, 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 James said quickly, reaching out to steady the young prince. You've done everything right. You've done something so right that it's changed everything for me. George looked confused and hurt. Then why are you leaving? James took George's hands in his own, his voice thick with emotion. Because of your kindness, I've remembered what it means to be truly present for my family. My wife has been offered an amazing job opportunity in Edinburgh, and Lily has been accepted to a prestigious performing arts school there. But you could stay here and visit them, George suggested desperately. I could, James agreed. But you taught me something, Your Highness. You showed me that family comes first. For 15 years, I chose duty over family. Thanks to you, I now have the chance to choose family over duty. George felt tears welling up in his eyes. But you're part of our family too. The statement made James's composure crack completely. Tears began streaming down his cheeks as he looked at the young boy who had changed his life. And you will always be part of mine, James replied, his voice breaking. What you've given me, the chance to be a real father, the reminder that I matter as a person, not just as a guard. These are gifts I can never repay. I don't want you to repay me, George said, tears now flowing down his own cheeks. I want you to stay. James pulled George into a gentle hug, something he would never have dared to do before their relationship had evolved beyond the formal boundaries of royal protocol. Your Highness, James whispered, you have to understand something. I'm not leaving because I don't love serving your family. I'm leaving because you taught me how to love my own family properly. As they separated, James wiped his eyes and tried to compose himself professionally. But the emotion was too strong. There's something else, James continued. The other guards and I have been talking. What you've started here has inspired all of us to reevaluate our priorities. George's heart sank further. Are all of you leaving? Not all, James clarified. But several of us are making changes. Marcus is reducing his hours so he can be more present for his son's education. Sarah is transferring to a position that allows her to live closer to her mother. George felt overwhelmed by the thought that his efforts to help had resulted in people leaving, but here's what you need to understand, James said, seeing the young prince's distress. We're not leaving because we're unhappy. We're making these changes because for the first time in years, we believe our happiness matters. You taught us that. I just wanted everyone to be happy while staying here, George said sadly. James smiled through his tears. And some of us will be happier staying. But others of us needed permission to put our families first, and you gave us that permission. Over the next hour, James explained how George's example had ripple effects throughout the royal staff. Some, like James, were choosing to prioritize family time. Others were using the new policies to pursue education or training that would advance their careers. Still others were simply enjoying the improved work-life balance without making major changes. What you created, James explained, wasn't just better working conditions. You created a culture where people feel valued and empowered to make choices that honor both their duty and their personal lives. That afternoon, the royal family held a farewell gathering for James in the castle's main reception room. Staff members from every department attended, along with some of their family members who had been invited for the special occasion. Lily Mitchell, now 13 and more confident than ever, stood beside her father with obvious pride. She had prepared a short speech for Prince George. Your Royal Highness, she began, her voice clear and strong. I want to thank you for giving me my daddy back. Because of your kindness, he was able to watch me grow from a scared little girl into someone who believes in herself. She paused, her own eyes becoming teary. I know you're sad that he's leaving, but I want you to know that you're coming with us in our hearts. My daddy tells me every day about the prince who taught him what really matters. When it came time for James to speak, he struggled to find words that could adequately express his gratitude. Your Royal Highnesses, he began formally, then turned to look directly at George. Prince George, when I first started this job 15 years ago, I thought I understood what it meant to serve. I thought service was about sacrifice, about giving up personal happiness for duty. He paused, his voice becoming stronger. You taught me that true service isn't about sacrifice, it's about caring. You didn't just serve your family by protecting us from threats. You served all of us by protecting our right to be human. The room was completely silent except for the sound of quiet crying from several staff members. I am leaving this position, James continued, but I am not leaving what you taught me. Wherever I go, whatever I do, I will remember the 10-year-old prince who saw past my uniform to my heart. As the gathering concluded and people began saying their individual goodbyes, George found himself alone with James one final time. James, George said quietly, will you write to me sometimes? And will you tell me how Lily is doing? I will write to you every month, James promised. And I will tell Lily's children about the prince who cared about their grandfather's happiness. And James, George added, his voice small but hopeful, if you ever want to come back even just to visit, you'll always be welcome. James knelt down one last time to look George in the eyes. Your Highness, I want you to know something. You didn't just change my life or the lives of the people in this castle. Your story has inspired people all over the world to be more compassionate leaders, more caring employers, and more thoughtful human beings. Really? George asked. Really, James confirmed. You started something that will continue long after we're all gone. You proved that kindness isn't weakness. It's the strongest form of leadership there is. As James walked away from Windsor Castle for the last time, he carried with him not just memories of 15 years of loyal service, but the life-changing lesson that a 10-year-old prince had taught him about the true meaning of nobility. George watched from his window as James's car disappeared down the long driveway. Though his heart was heavy with the sadness of goodbye, it was also full of the knowledge that he had helped James find the happiness he deserved. That evening, as George reflected on the day with his parents, he made a quiet resolution. Mummy, Daddy, he said thoughtfully, I want to keep helping people be happy, even when it means saying goodbye. Catherine and William looked at their son with boundless pride, knowing that his simple act of noticing a crying guard had grown into a philosophy that would guide him for the rest of his life. Prince George had learned that true leadership meant caring enough about people to help them find their own path to happiness, even when that path led away from you. It was a lesson that would serve him well in all the years to come, as he continued to touch lives with the same quiet kindness that had changed everything for James Mitchell, and so many others. The story of the 10-year-old prince who taught the world about compassion had come full circle, ending not with accolades or recognition, but with the simple, profound understanding that the greatest gift a leader can give is the permission for others to flourish, wherever that journey might take them.